Hello, good morning, good evening, or whichever it is for you. Welcome to rather a unique little experiment. We've Ethical Space and European Journalism Network have got together, and we're having a world conference on the pandemic and how it's reported worldwide. So there'll be people from Australia, from Spain, from Italy, from the UK. Questions, the panel are welcome to ask questions at any point. If they just use Zoom chat is probably the best way for that. Or just intervene. The audience watching by email, please send your questions by email or by YouTube chat. So first, Dorothy Byrne, who's the editor at large at Channel 4, and was until very, very recently the head of news and current affairs and responsible for much of their pandemic coverage. She's also the chair of the Ethical Journalism Network. Dorothy, over to you.
Thank you. I've been immensely proud to be a journalist in this pandemic. Across all parts of our industry in the UK, there has been outstanding journalism, which I believe has genuinely saved lives by revealing the truth about, for example, deaths in care homes and lack of PPE equipment. We've surged an urgent public need. As soon as the emergency became clear, the public turned to trusted television journalists for their information. A survey published on April the 9th by the UK media regulator Ofcom found the average television daily news viewing was up by 92% in March compared to the year before. Channel 4 News doubled its number of young viewers on many nights. Trust in television news is traditionally high in the UK because the public know it's regulated, and it increased even more in these times. 83% of people now say they trust BBC and Channel 4 News, 82% ITV News, and 75% Sky News. Some had been saying before COVID-19 that the UK system of broadcasting was outdated and we should move more towards the US system in which major broadcasters are allowed to be partial and opinionated in their news. We've not heard that said now. So-called mainstream media was now irrelevant. Well, in fact, it's proved essential for giving the public key information. Before this pandemic, a number of politicians had even stopped appearing on television or the radio, except in sound bites, friendly chats, and photo opportunities. However, they realised in this emergency that if they wanted to win the public over to lockdown, they needed to appear regularly on TV and be quizzed at length by journalists. For much of this crisis, the official British opposition was not holding the government to account in the normal way, which would happen in a democracy. They were in the midst of electing a new leader, and Parliament couldn't sit for health and safety reasons as it normally would. It's been journalists who've taken on the duty of inquiring into and challenging official statistics about matters as vital as how many deaths there really were and how many COVID-19 tests were actually being carried out each day. It's been notable that some of the best journalism here has come from newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, natural supporters of the ruling Conservative Party. Health correspondents have come into their own. They're not a flashy group of people and don't have the high profile of on-screen political editors. But good old-fashioned journalistic endeavour, talking to people across our 4 nations who work in care homes and hospitals at every level, from care home cleaners to leading consultants, they have tracked down the truth. I've really admired those professionals who talk to reporters because some of them were threatened with disciplinary action. It's been notable that journalists have treated patients and relatives with real respect. The British tabloid have a record of preying on the grieving and dying, but I've not seen that here. However, this crisis has also put into stark relief a key deficit in UK journalism, a lack of journalists with scientific training. Journalists have struggled, especially at the beginning, to put to the test official scientific claims including the notion that there is such a thing as the science. Quite a few fell for the idea that there was only one accepted scientific view, and that it could ever be the role of scientists to control government policy rather than give advice to inform policy. I felt that sometimes political editors were leading coverage when really we needed to hear from science and data correspondents. This is a political story, a health story, a science story, and a data story. Sometimes we had the inappropriate specialist journalists struggling to tell the story. We need to get more people with expertise in data and science involved in reporting. Tim Harford in More or Less on BBC Radio has been brilliant, and we need more like him as soon as possible because this story is going to go on for years. And finally, it was gratifying to see journalists waking up and realizing who really runs the country. It's not politicians. They finally discovered the value of supermarket self-stackers, delivery workers, hospital cleaners, and carers. And it was great to see that they got the recognition they deserved. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Over to the other side of the world, to Donald Matheson, who will introduce our next presenter.
Thank you, Dorothy Byrne. And now we turn to Jan Zhang on the news coverage in the country where the virus began, in China. Jan is a fellow at the China Media Observatory at the Università della Svizzera Italiana. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Donat. And I wish also to say thanks to my colleagues at AGO and also the conference organizer of gathering all of us today here to talk about this pandemic. And today I will briefly present like the 4 phases I try to identify about how the Chinese news was reporting about COVID-19 from a domestic epidemic to a world pandemic. The first news coverage appeared in China more or less on the last day of December 2019. And during the first 3 weeks of January, it was the first phase, as I identified, and there were 2 main focuses. The first focus was to ease the public attention, to shift the public attention in order to avoid the panic. And due to the fact that at that time, the local Wuhan Health Commission, they still did not confirm the virus was highly contagious for people-to-people contact. So the mainstream media outlet at that time was more or less following this a statement. And the second focus was to combat the online rumor about a SARS-like pneumonia was coming back, which was somehow released by this group of by the end of December. And one very interesting thing here is that most of the news stories at that time was either reported by the national media or by regional media from Beijing and Shanghai. So this is one perfect example to evidence this particular practice of cross-region reporting in China, which gives much more freedom for some regional media to report sensitive issues happening in another region and against other local governments. So in general, media in Wuhan at that time remained quite quiet and also late in response. On January 20, the state broadcaster CCTV finally confirmed that the virus was highly contagious. And then only from this moment on, the Chinese media starts to report about COVID-19 extensively. And there were 3 main features during the second phase between January 20 till late February. The first one was the mainstream media began to offer a lot of positive and constructive coverage. And the second is the investigative journalism start to throw bombs to the local authorities and questioning and accusing the responsibility of them by this information delay. And the third feature was this large use of data visualization and social media. So there was a kind of diversified voices emerging from social media, joining the mainstream news reports at that time. And in order to connect the different realities in Wuhan during its lockdown to the outside world. And the third phase was between late February till mid-March. The situation in China was somehow like stabilized, but the epicenter starts to travel from Asia and back and to Europe. And there were also like three main features of this phase. The first one was like there was a shift by the Chinese media blaming those Chinese who traveled abroad at that time and bring the virus to other countries, to blaming Chinese who live in other countries and bringing in the virus again to China. And the second is a kind of comparison of the different measurements in different societies to China, and in order to favor the successful experience that China had been done like in the past months. And the third was slowly the Chinese media start to praise the effort by China to support other countries to combat the COVID-19. And the fourth phase was somehow after mid of March till nowadays. So when the epidemic center moved to the United States. So the comparing to when the epicenter was in Europe, this kind of comparison become much harsher in the US case offered by Chinese media, especially focused on the failure of the Trump administration in missing the best time window to put the entire situation in good control. And especially after Trump flags heavy criticism towards Beijing, the Chinese media began to somehow try to overturn this global perception of the virus was originated in China.
1 minute, sorry to be.
Yeah,
one more minute.
And this kind of diversified voices from February starts to merge into one unified and defending voice. And so both legacy media and social media in China in this time, they were pushing back a very aggressive like media campaign through different media information sources. So what I want to say the last is the situation between China and America was already very fragile after the escalated trade war between the two countries. And this blame shift about COVID-19 and also this hatred emotions from both mainstream media and social media absolutely accelerated these hostilities between the two societies. And this is really not that healthy for the public in the two countries in this very moment in time. So that's my part. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, the virus has hit Europe quite hard. Boris Johnson claims that Britain is a world leader. Well, we are a world leader in death per head of population at the moment, it seems. Spain and Italy were particularly harshly hit before it came to Britain. Let's go first to Spain, to Hector Force from UCM in Madrid. He's followed by Cristina Lopez, also from UCM, and then they'll analyze the part the media played in this. Right, over to you, Hector.
Here I am, I think. Thank you very much. So I would like to talk briefly about how several mistakes of the government communication policy is increasing the presence of far right during this pandemic time. So we need first to consider that the government was very fresh. The government just take power at the beginning of the year, and on March the 14th, the state of alarm started with the lockdown of all the Spaniards in our homes. And we have now a very slight majority in the parliament and a very strong presence of far right. And in this very moment, Vox, the far right party, is managing to have the center of the political discourse about the pandemic, both because the lack of transparency of press conference of the government and because several mistakes and contradictions repeatedly again and again. This is a picture from last weekend. It was called the Caravan for Freedom and Future. There was thousands of cars and motorbikes everywhere in the streets of Spain. And this is a list of several affirmations of the extreme right against the government, that the government is killing people, that is responsible for the deaths, and also an accusation that you will recognize in the style of Donald Trump, that media is accomplished with the government trying to silence citizenship and trying to undercover a kind of state of emergency in which freedom of expression is limited. One of the reasons because of why this discourse is working so well from the extreme right is erratic politics on press conference from the government. From the very beginning, there was no video conference with the journalists. So journalists were sharing a WhatsApp group, and they were sending their questions there. And the head of communication of the government, Miguel Ángel Oliver, was filtering them. So the journalists were very angry, and they complained in a letter that 500 journalists signed, and journalists from all the spectrum of political opinion, from the right to the left, mainstream media, alternative media, asking the journalists to change the model. And just after this big conflict, the government returned to video conference, very open. So journalists were able to ask and re-ask if they were not happy with the answers. And now the press conference are returning to be face to face. There was also a lot of mistakes and contradiction here. In the picture, you can see in the center is Fernando Simón, that is the head of the sanitary emergency of the government. But he was supported by police and military generals. And in one moment, the head of the civil war says something like, "We are monitoring social networks in order to minimize the climate against government." That was later denied by the minister, but the main idea was that the government was controlling the public opinion in order to grant it support there. Also, the National Sociological Research that is taking monthly add a question about how the citizens feel about to limit freedom of expression in order to ensure the quality of information. So you have several mistakes that in one way are preparing the soil to the discourse of the extreme right on conspiracy and suspicion. And for instance, you have in one moment, WhatsApp decide to limit worldwide the sharing of forward messages, and at the same time, they decide to offer a list of fact checkers to everybody. So the rephrasing of these WhatsApp ideas has been that government and media are together conspiring in order to hamper citizens to avoid to know the reality about the pandemic. So in the conclusion, it's not. It's of course, this is not the only reason why far right is having the centrality of the discourse during this time, but both the lack of transparency in the press conferences, the conflict with journalists, and several wrong communication decisions prepare and pave the way to facilitate populist far right to message through permeate into the public space and to occupy the centrality. Thank you.
Okay, straight over to you, Cristina.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cristina López García, and I'm a doctoral researcher in journalism at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Well, it's a pleasure to share with you this conference, and thanks, Hector, for putting into context the Spanish political and media situation. Today, I would like to talk about infoxication, infodemics, and disinformation, and specifically about this infodemic in the coronavirus crisis in Spain. I would like to start by pointing out that the coronavirus pandemic is an unprecedented situation for contemporary society that is transforming us in many different aspects. One of them is the way we produce and consume information, which is strongly influenced in recent years by the digital environment. In this context, three processes occur consecutively and feedback into each other: infoxication, infodemics, and disinformation. The strong interest in the pandemic has led to information overload, which is infoxication, that prevents calm reflection, the quality of sources, and the news reliability. Media and citizens share false content, which spreads rapidly, causing infodemics and feeding disinformation when it's on purpose, or misinformation when it's unintentionally. Before the outbreak of the pandemic, disinformation was already considered a global threat because of its potential damage. In the wake of coronavirus crisis, this menace has become evident and intensified. Disinformation about the current pandemic is more toxic and more deadly than disinformation about other subjects, because not only has a direct impact on every person, but also upon whole societies. This is how the term disinfodemic came about. The fact-checking site Maldita.es has reported more than 500 fake news related to the pandemic during the latest months. The topics, the authors, and the aims are varied. Today, I'm going to focus on two areas which can significantly affect citizens and society, which are health and politics. The objective is to understand how they came about, who created them, and what interests they conceal. Firstly, we analyze disinformation and health as an opportunity for pseudoscience. Certain groups or individuals take advantage of people's fears and ignorance to introduce unscientific theories that may put public health at risk. Regarding this issue, there are two main disinformation currents: treatments to fight against the illness and denial of the seriousness of the virus. On the one hand, unreliable sources propose different remedies, such as eating certain foods to prevent or cure the virus, like well water with garlic, ginger, lemon juice, hot liquids, etc. And on the other hand, messages that compare the gravity of the coronavirus and its effects with the flu seasonal have been viralized. In some cases, the origin of the rumor is unknown. In others, the authors are influencers and supposed doctors and experts. These sources use their authority, recognition, or visibility to promote unhealthy practices. This can lead not only to the abandon of effective hygiene and prevention measures, such as hand washing, social distance, or the use of masks, but also to the consumption of dangerous products. Regarding disinformation and politics, we focus on the struggle for the story, building and controlling the storytelling of the crisis in order to influence the public opinion, as Hector said before, is one of the current political goals. Political parties and think tanks are fighting a battle for information, not only about the health consequences, but also about the economic impact and the measures taken by governments to combat the pandemic. In this context, disinformation also comes into play. One of the most mediatic cases in Spain is the photo montage of the Gran Via in Madrid full of coffins. The image was accompanied by the following text: "The Spanish are making a lot of images spontaneously. This one perfectly portrays the pain of the tragedy that the government and its media satellites are trying to hide." This photo and this message were shared from the Twitter account of the Spanish far-right party Vox. The content does not make it clear that the image is a montage, and it involves an emotive narrative construct. In conclusion, I would like to point out that in a democratic society, providing citizens with access to reliable and quality information is essential to help them to make decisions in their best interest. This requires avoiding the dissemination of false information. However, it is essential to establish transparent control system that prevents censorship and provide an appropriate balance between the freedom of expression and the right to information. And that's all. Thanks you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christina. And lots of people are watching all over the world. People in Britain, there's a whole iconography about bookshelves. My bookshelf behind me is rather different. Those are all my books, said he rather arrogantly. One of the things about the pandemic is about science and pseudoscience. It's a medical crisis, but also it's a crisis of science. Many governments have done what they call following the science. Were they right or were they wrong? What's the science? Brian Winston is a Lincoln professor at Lincoln University. He's a former TV producer. He's followed by Philip DeSalvo on data journalism, finally by Dr. Alex Connock of the Said Business School at Oxford University on some of the myths coming out of social media. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, evening, whatever. Okay, I'm going to pick up what Dorothy was saying right at the outset. I think she's absolutely right that we have basically done a pretty good job. But the one real failure, and it has been a crucial and indeed fatal one, has been the way in which we have been reporting the science. Between, say, I don't know, the declaration of the pandemic and our decision to lock down, there were, in fact, 11 fatal days. Our Prime Minister was seen iconographically literally following the science. Two elderly chaps, one bald in suits, walked out, stood on two lecterns, and in the middle he walked out and he said, "I'm following the science." And the two chaps were two of our leading health scientists. You couldn't make it up, really, the infantile notion of following the science. As the author Tolkien says, ask not of the elves their advice, for they will tell you both to stay and to go. And that is true of science. There's no such thing as the science. And we are incredibly unable to cope with uncertainty. Probabilistics is what is actually being spoken about when we talk about epidemiology. And people have no idea that we have substituted Newtonian certainties with a probabilistic universe. The business of science, now, 70 years ago, according to the physicist and philosopher Thomas Kuhn, is actually to falsify premises, to actually, what you say, oh, the Earth is the center of the universe. You look through the telescope, doesn't quite work. You keep accumulating anomalies. Eventually, the anomalies cause a period of scientific revolution, and you get a new one. Hello, Mr. Copernicus. We're still living with that, although we've got dark matter and blah, and blah, and blah. So in a couple of thousand years, probably we won't be living with that one either. The fact of the matter is there is no science here. There is a difference in science. There's a hard sciences and soft sciences. And basically, we have been dealing with soft sciences, with behaviorism. You paint a photograph, you paint a flea on a gentleman's urinal, and you improve the hygiene of a gentleman's toilet, public toilet. I mean, that's what we're talking about, really. And treat it as if it's actually some sort of gospel is absurd. In fact, what happened was Public Health England was given the operational control of the virus, which was itself an absurdity because our National Health Service should have had that. And Public Health England opted for herd immunity. Herd immunity is a wonderful idea. It arises as a result of an outbreak of measles in Philadelphia in 1937. Now, come on. That is not a direct analogy. Most of the literature on herd immunity is actually highly theoretical. The government was following the science. It was just rubbish. To use a scientific term which you might not be familiar with, it's really garbage in this situation. And the other scientists who showed up to say, hey, fellas, this is garbage, an epistemologist, epidemiologist rather, called Neil Ferguson, for instance, and a group of people basically in the Imperial College of Science in London, what do they know, were saying, you guys are out of your skulls. And they were being treated. And I saw this, as we all did, on the television by these senior health officials who were being followed, who were actually dismissing them in a quite outrageous fashion, until, of course, it became unavoidable and we went into lockdown. So the point about this is that journalists have done very, very well. But I have a view of journalism which is totally conditioned by English journalistic history. 300 years ago, one of the fathers of the British press, Marchmont Needham, it's one of my favorite quotations, said, I took up my pen for the tearing down of veils, vizards, and disguises. And when you get into this situation, life and death situations, then I can think of nothing else that journalists have to do. They have to do lots of other things, of course. But in this situation, tearing down veils, vizards, and disguises is important. Now, we have this saying in Britain that, you approach politicians as a journalist wondering why this lying bastard is lying to me. You never approach scientists like that. They're God. Well, some of them are. They're physicists or chemists or serious scientists, but some of them are actually jumped up journalists like sociologists, and therefore should not be treated with the respect of their peers. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you, Brian, very much indeed. Over to you, Philippe, in Switzerland.
So hi everyone, I hope you can hear me correctly. Thanks for having me to this conference here today. Today I'm going to present you the preliminary results of a paper I'm working on about how data journalism was used by Italian journalists to explain and report on the coronavirus pandemic. And as everybody of us know, data and data journalism has been one of the most important channels of communication about the pandemic in most of the countries. And we saw an abundance of graphs and tables and a statistic analysis about the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in all our countries. And this has been true also in Italy, where we saw much of data journalism coming up in the public sphere, which is usually not the case for Italy, since data journalism is lacking in Italy a proper infrastructure and resources, contrarily to other countries like Germany and the UK. So data journalism usually in Italy is pretty rare. We don't see much of it. And on top of that, some of the most important news and media outlets in the country don't have data units. So it was pretty much a new situation. So in order to make sense of what were the issues and what were the strategies that Italian data journalists adopted in order to cover the pandemic, I've conducted some interviews with some of them, with those who were mostly engaged with covering the pandemic through data. And so far I've been talking with 5 different data journalists working for different news outlets, from daily national newspapers to local newsrooms. And those are Isaia Invernizzi, a journalist based at Eco di Bergamo, the local newspaper of the city of Bergamo, which was one of the most badly affected cities in Italy. Riccardo Saporiti, who is a scientific journalist, a freelancer working mostly for Wired and Il Sole 24 Ore, which is a financial daily. Luca Salvioni, which is the head of the data department, so to say, at Il Sole 24 Ore, and Alessio Cimarelli, who is a data scientist turned journalist who works for an independent organization called Data Ninja. And I've conducted a thematic analysis of what were the outcomes of these interviews, and 5 patterns have emerged from my colloquiums with journalists. The first one was that all journalists shared a very critical view about the official data and figures that were released by public authorities and state. All the journalists I've been talking to denounced that the data was incorrect, that the data was mostly not representative of the real spread of the pandemic. They particularly criticized the civil department, the civil protection department in Italy, for not releasing very useful data, which were telling only a small part of the pandemic spread in the country. Following this state of things, data journalists needed to find new strategies and new sources of data to effectively report on the pandemic in the country. And basically they had to look beyond the official figures to actually have a chance to tell a story that really was representative of what was going on. And a great example of this came from Eco di Bergamo in particular, where data journalists tried to make sense of the pandemic in their region by looking at the mortality rate in the city. And they were able to demonstrate that the number of people who lost their lives during the pandemic weeks was much higher than what the official figures were saying. Then data journalists also pointed that there is a strong lack of data literacy among journalists, especially in the mainstream, which is mostly due to the fact that the most important and established data journalists in Italy are freelancers who have started their interest in data reporting on their own. There is a lack of training, there is a lack of infrastructure for data journalists in the country, and this was reflected in how, for instance, mainstream media were reporting on statistics. So the expert data journalists I've been talking to have denounced how much poor sometimes data were reported by mainstream media. And this was also visible in a diffuse sense of dataism where data, although it was known that data was not particularly reliable in telling the story, they were still very much reported every day. And then all the data journalists also underlined again the impact of the structural limitation of the Italian market for data journalism. And in particular, they all expressed a wish for the future. And they said that this pandemic really showed to everyone how much important and crucial data journalists can be in telling the story of something that is not visible in material terms like a pandemic. So there is the hope that this new awareness about the importance of data-driven reporting could have an impact, positive impact on Italian journalism and push for more data-driven reporting. So these are just the preliminary results of my research so far, and I look forward to the full paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. Over to you, Alex, from Oxford, but indeed from Cheshire, rather than Oxford.
John and Richard, thanks so much, and thanks to everyone. So I'm Dr. Alex Connock, and in this section we've heard from Brian on the science and then from Philippe on the data, and I'm very interested in the digital marketing and the journalism, and that's kind of the third part of that equation, the blurry lines between the two disciplines. In fact, digital marketing has in many ways become a key component of successful journalism. In newspapers, for instance, if you don't get your message out via social networks, you don't get the numbers, and you probably don't even keep your job. And I want to address that digital marketing analogy by talking about a key dimension of coronavirus, which is the network effect and how it's worked in 3 dimensions. First, the viral transmission. Second, the viral marketing of conspiracy theories. And third, the actual attacks on the phone network itself, largely because of those conspiracy theories. And taking the 3 together, we've been at a kind of peak network effect, infecting each other, posting viral news, and then pointlessly smashing up the phone network. Now, it's always useful in always a natural human desire in a crisis to find an elusive bigger picture, and we'll find that throughout history. It's become a priority for many during this lockdown, the conspiracy theories of secret labs, microchipping, vaccinations, and so forth. And never mind the fact that finding the singular solution may well be impossible. In fact, it was impossible to find, it was the impossibility of finding a solution to the problem of the 7 bridges of Königsberg and how to cross them all without repeating yourself that would led the mathematician Euler in the 1730s to actually create network theory in the first place. So some quick detail on the network effect in corona. Step 1, the virus spreads through a nasty form of kind of network marketing with a reproduction number, which is called R, which you need to keep below 1 in order to slow the virus down. In digital marketing, these are part of the analytical tools. So you have something called the customer lifetime social value, which is the value of a customer combined with everyone that they might evangelize to the product. And market research agencies give net promoter scores to brands based on how many users would advocate them to their friends with a score of 9 out of 10 or more. And what we've actually been trying to do is to try and collectively to get the virus's net promoter score down below its current level. Step 2 in the peak network effect is this business of conspiracy theory diffusion. And of course, it's social networks that allow theories to spread across the world in a very efficient set of thought bubbles that are global in scale, but also closed off to everyone else. And these are all about origins, cures, vaccinations, supposed conspirators, and so forth. And they're spread in a number of ways. They're amplified by fake users from Russia and Iran and elsewhere that are designed to kind of amplify any kind of troublemaking. Then they enter the real human mainstream, often by celebrity super spreaders. And those celebrities then become the gateway drug by which socially networked conspiracies reach the mainstream. And then finally, in that peak network effect, we see the actual phone network itself. Ironically, the very network that is enabling the memes and videos and iPhones of celebrity viral conspirators is actually under attack by people in the UK and the US. And I think in Spain as well, actually. In April 2020, 77 UK phone masts were attacked, including one at least in Birmingham, which was actually serving a new hospital, which had been designed to protect people against COVID-19. So these theories are beamed efficiently around by the nation by phone masts, even as 5G protesters announce to each other on their phones how to demolish them. So in conclusion, the coronavirus is a particular moment in our media history when the nature of the problem, which is the transmission of the virus, the explanation for it, which is the debate on social media around existentially important conspiracy theories of one type or other, and the transmission of all the information we require on the phone network, all revolve around the same set of theories, which is networking. So network theory, and that's a useful framework, I think, through which to look at coronavirus and its diffusion. Thanks.
Okay. Over to Donald Matheson in New Zealand to introduce 2 or 3 papers from Australia and New Zealand. Donald. Can we hear Donald, please?
Yes, thank you. I needed to unmute myself. My apologies. Thank you very much. I'd first like to introduce Matthew Ricketson from Deakin University, talking about Australia's public broadcaster, and then Francisca Vader from the University of Queensland, talking about Australian coverage in general. So thank you. Matthew, if you'd like to begin.
Sure, thanks, Donald. Well, to understand the way in which the media has been covering the COVID-19 in Australia, you really need to understand the media environment here. And there's a few salient points which you may know, but just to remind you in case you don't, because we've got a global audience, obviously. First thing is it's a very concentrated media ownership landscape here in Australia, primarily by News Corp Australia, more so even than in the UK and the United States. The second main point would be the public broadcasting sector is a significant presence in Australia. It's not as large or anywhere near as well funded as the BBC in the United Kingdom, but it is a much more significant presence than the undernourished public broadcasting sector in the United States. The next point is that the business model that has supported for many, many years mainstream media companies has collapsed in this country as in others. The advertising revenue that it once relied on to make handsome profits has been vacuumed up by global digital behemoths, namely Facebook and Google. Since 2013, we have had a Conservative Liberal National Party coalition government running the country, which has been either unable or unwilling or both to provide any kind of substantive media policy in Australia, other than piecemeal license fee reductions for the commercial television networks or one-off handouts of about $30 million to News Corporation Australia's subscription television network, Foxtel. Next main point is that there have been mass layoffs, either voluntary or targeted redundancies of journalists. Between 2011 and 2017, about a quarter of all the journalists working in Australia have either taken a voluntary departure package or have been laid off. So what that means is in the media environment where journalists are expected to do audio and video and text and online and tweet and engage with audiences and so on, there are fewer of them doing more stories. And so that means we have many more thinner stories or no stories at all about particular areas. Which have been identified, particularly in Australia, as coverage of local councils, regional and rural areas, what are called news deserts. Since 2017 and into this particular period we're in now, the coronavirus, and indeed today, another announcement of major job cuts in Australia affecting all of the major news outlets. Today, it was News Corporation Australia's turn to lay off a whole lot of journalists and to announce the closure or suspension of a lot of its local and community outlets. So to summarise, we've got a media ecosystem here which has significant structural weaknesses, a failing business model, and a flaccid media policy response from government. All right. So I want to, in the talking I'm doing for you tonight, I want to focus on a couple of interrelated aspects. The first is the unlikely rise of a hitherto largely unheralded journalist in the public broadcasting sector. And the second is the continued prosecution of labyrinthine byways of the culture wars, primarily by News Corporation Australia outlets, all amid a once-in-a-century pandemic. So, the unheralded public broadcaster is Norman Swan, who I'm pretty confident you wouldn't have heard of before this year, but you may well have heard of him now. He's been the presenter and producer of a program called The Health Report, pretty obvious what it's about, since 1985. It's a long time he's been doing that program. He does that on the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, but he does it on what's called Radio National, which is a small specialist arm or segment of the overall network. And if I can, this might be a little bit crude, but if I can just summarize, well, I won't, because I'm running out of time, I can see, so I won't bother with the joke at this point. I can come back to that if you like. So he's experienced, he is a medical doctor by training. His program is a little bit like eating muesli, though, with not quite enough milk in the bowl. So it's very good for you, but it's a bit chewy. He's become a household name. He's not only been doing his program, he's been appearing everywhere. He's produced a podcast. He appears for daily updates on other ABC programs, on radio and television. It's even got to the point where the ABC, in promoting its programs, will include him with sort of self-deprecating jokes about him. The larger backdrop, and one of the key reasons why I think he has become so prominent, is that there has been a significant diminution of specialist reporters in the health area in the last 15 years or so. Major report done here last year said there's been a 30% decline in the number of stories about health in the Australian newsprint media. So his coverage has been picked up. The ABC's ratings have improved. Its engagement with audiences have improved. There's been some surveys to show that trust in the ABC has grown. And however, the News Corporation Australia publications, in particular, the Daily Telegraph and the Australian, have engaged in a kind of war, internecine war against Swan, criticising him on his reporting. They're the kinds of stories that, unless you follow the media with a fine-tooth comb, as I'm required to do, you kind of don't know where they're coming from. You don't know what they mean. You just know there's a general smearing of this person and this organisation. Anyone who's followed News Corp's career trajectory over many, many years knows that that's not new, but it is what's striking, and I'll just finish on this point, is that at a time when we have a global pandemic, which clearly is of enormous worry and concern to citizens around the world, we've got people turning quite seriously and devotedly to a public sector broadcaster person who was not known in the past, but is now a national name. And we've got the largest print and online news organisation in the country, News Corp Australia, which is kind of engaged in sniping and culture wars, and as well as other aspects of its reporting, which have been good, but this has certainly diminished what they are doing and clouded what is an important issue in a lot of, I won't use the word I was thinking of using, but clouded in a lot of crap, really. So I will finish there because I'm pretty conscious I'm out of time.
Thank you. Francesca, over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's pretty hard now to add something from an Australian perspective, because it's like a very good introduction in how the situation is at the moment. Just to kind of mention at the beginning that I'm I think the last year was full of disruptions in terms of coming from the German-speaking countries, from Germany and in Austria, where we live, to Australia, then facing the bushfire season full on, with the Prime Minister that kind of disappeared from the public sphere, and then have a very special bonding to New Zealand, where again it is really interesting to now observe what is happening in the COVID-19 pandemic phase with the media. And why I'm mentioning it at the beginning is that in Germany there was a pretty beautiful process of media ethics, like really going on discussion, where media and communication scholars really stepped up and criticized, especially public broadcasters, being very supportive of the government without getting back to their critique and control function we often talk about. And so there was a very lively discourse that I kind of missed in Australia. So only a few media and communication scholars really jumped on this topic and kind of came up, like really pointing out a few developments that are really not good, and or at least have to be discussed. And the interesting thing where I opened up New Zealand, or this perspective to New Zealand, is that Australia is in this very special situation that there's always Jacinda Ardern doing like really well, being like one of the like stars on the sky of leadership in this crisis. And in New Zealand, there is the situation that the media are very, very supportive, that they kind of not at all criticise the government and the decisions there. And I think in Australia, it is different in terms of like very economic focus of like everything, of the Prime Minister, of everything, how it's done. And this is what we can see when we observe the corona reporting over time. It started with some economic considerations. This is what I would call like the first phase of corona reporting in Australia. It was really like it had a strong economic focus when it started in China because of all the economic relationships to China, and it's very, very dense relationship, and therefore it was a big economic question. So what is happening in China? Then we had like the outbreak in Australia and New Zealand, like in the Pacific area, and then it was definitely about health issues predominantly, but then it kind of came back to this whole economic discussion again. And this is what was just mentioned before, that these economic threat and the whole economic questions, they are very dominant, and the whole media system is really, really struggling. I would like to point out a thought that relates a bit more to my research, and this is the crisis of the community and local media that you already mentioned. So thanks for like putting this up for discussion already, because I think this is these like local and community-based media, they take pretty seriously, or usually take pretty seriously, their ethical obligations and this kind of trust building. So they have a very strong relationship, and they offer like a beautiful space usually for those discussions about what is happening right here in my neighborhood. And I think there's a lot of like missed potential and missed opportunities for local media to actually make this pandemic, pick it up as a topic that really relates to what is happening right in front of our doors, right in our community, in our neighborhood. And of course now, especially in Australia, they are kind of cut off. They are, that's one of the effects of this restructuration of the News Corporation, that the community and regional newspapers go to digital only. So, which will definitely not suit many of the remote regions. And therefore, I think, again, it is like I think it's a bigger issue than only, like, we can look at it, or we can problematize it from a journalist perspective, like what is happening to these journalists, what is happening to all these communicators, but then we can problematize it from this kind of community building, trust building, media ethical point of view, which I would like to do. I think local and community media are an essential service. So they are really able to create public deliberation processes. And so I think all these questions are really worth to be posed and to be discussed. Like, where do we miss the local media in terms of talking about this question? What determines our like very individual decisions? What role does social isolation play, like really here in my community? Those questions have to be carefully investigated and reported, and not only on a national level, and not only with a global perspective, but with like a really local and community focus. Here, these expert lay gaps can be overcome pretty nicely. Here, complexity can be reduced, the complexity of a global crisis, and the individual impact, the local impacts can be much better contextualized. So I think that's a very, very important point to really talk further and do more research on the potential of local media.
Thank you, Francisca. We'll return to the UK now with Barry Turner from Lincoln University, who, working with Jasmine McDonald, who is at RMIT in Melbourne, will bring us to, as a in closing to the experience of journalists and reporting disasters and the psychological stresses they face. So thank you very much, Barry.
Hello. I'm not sure the screen switched over yet, but I'll carry on talking anyway. I just want to say congratulations. The severe criticism I just heard of science journalism, which I 100% concur with. I teach science and environmental journalism at the university where I work, and I also teach pharmacogenomics and molecular genetics in the pharmacy school. So I do have an understanding of where the two cultures of journalism and science find it very difficult to join together with each other and get a coherent message. But actually, that's what I'm here to talk about at the moment. What I'm here to talk about is the impact that this pandemic is having on journalists. We've been bombarded on a daily basis with what looks like a World War I casualty list of the number of people who've died of COVID, both nationally and internationally. It should be borne in mind that as of the 26th, last Tuesday, 111 journalists have died of COVID-19 also, many of whom it's believed have contracted COVID while reporting on the subject. So we have a significant casualty list among journalists of this pandemic. Now, I strongly avoid most of the time war metaphors, particularly in things like cancer reporting, where we hear this expression, lost their wonderful battle, etc., etc. But I think here we can allow ourselves to indulge in war metaphors. The global pandemic here is, of course, a natural disaster, just like an earthquake or a volcano going off or a tsunami or something like that. It's just playing out over a much longer period. The casualties we're seeing are far higher than most natural disasters we see, but like natural disasters and like war reporting, we're seeing a significant number of journalists apparently as casualties of this particular pandemic. The casualties that I'm looking at are a particular area of interest of mine, those suffering from mental health disorders as a result of it, post-traumatic stress disorder, as it's frequently referred to, which is like autism in its day, actually a spectrum of conditions. But it is now being seen to be impacting significantly on journalists reporting from war zones and reporting from disaster areas, mainly because there are a particular set of journalists who seem to be constantly reporting from these particular scenarios. So we're familiar with the idea of a dedicated war reporter being in a war zone constantly. We know that they have if you take any notice of statistics, a 28 to a 30% higher risk of the incidence of psychiatric illness within their life. Interestingly, having looked at how those statistics were come by, it's to be noted that no more journalists self-report mental illness than report any other types of mental illness. The conclusion we can draw from that is the mental illness affecting these journalists, PTSD in particular, is being reported by other people, including where journalists themselves are being involuntarily admitted to psychiatric hospitals as a result of the mental illnesses they've suffered while reporting on disaster areas. And as I keep mentioning, this pandemic is a global disaster area. Looking at some of the psychological theory, a disaster is split into phases. And because this is a disaster which is ongoing over months or possibly even years, we start with what is known as a heroic phase. And we've seen the reporters enthusiastically indulge in this, where we talk about the getting together with the sort of blitz spirit. There's another war metaphor, the idea that communities rebuild, etc. The idea that there's more cooperation between people. And of course, that's very, very, very true. We then see it mature into what's known as a honeymoon phase, where the sort of excitement of the original heroic phase disappears, but we still see generated optimism. Still, we still see much more collaboration and cooperation within society than we normally do. But then we sadly head into the third phase, which is known as the disillusionment phase. And the disillusionment phase is noted by social psychologists to last very, very much longer than the first two phases. And this is in the phase in which we see the psychiatric illnesses manifest themselves. So we will see people expressing PTSD in this disillusionment phase. And if I can just allow a little political indulgence, of course, one of the things that's propelled us into this disillusionment stage is the fiasco since last Friday of Dominic Cummings, the aide to the Prime Minister, flouting the very rules that he himself assisted in drawing up, which has caused one of the biggest public outrages in years about the activities of government, and certainly one of the longest lasting. So we are now entering into this disillusionment phase, which is affecting journalists as well as members of the public. We've even seen the powers that be turn their fire on journalists because journalists are being more critical. Emily Maitlis has come under fire. Laura Kuenssberg's come under fire for breaching journalistic ethics. Rather ironic when you consider it what it is that they're breaching the ethics about. But we are likely to be going into a phase now where we're going to see more journalists affected by the constant reporting of casualty figures, deaths, people who have not been able to go and see their loved ones when they were dying as a result of lockdown, etc. So we are now very much in this disillusionment phase. And I think if I can end on a sort of a warning here, I think we need to be bracing ourselves to be seeing casualties not only in terms of people contracting the virus itself, but suffering from the effects of being constantly within this sphere of reporting.
Thank you very much, Barry. Now, just before I go off for a drive into the Cotswolds to check my eyesight like Dominic Cummings, we've got about 5 minutes to discuss. Every paper presented today, please, a long version of it. Richard Keeble is eager and waiting for you to write up to 6,000 words to send to him for Ethical Space in the autumn. Does anybody have a burning point they'd want to make? No, nobody's got a burning issue they want to raise?
I've got a question.
Go on then. Go on.
For Barry, thank you, Barry, for that really interesting talk. I'm curious where the statistics came from of the number of journalists who you said have died of COVID-19, which is kind of alarming. I'm curious where that information comes from, because obviously I haven't seen it.
Emblem campaign, they reported on May 1st when 55 journalists had died, and by May the 26th it's 111. So we can assume that there'll be probably some more. So you'll find it on the Press Emblem campaign website.
Thank you.
Any more questions to anybody else?
John?
Yes,
could
Richard
I ask
Keeble.
Matthew to tell us his joke?
Okay, it goes to a former colleague of mine who was interviewed for a job many years ago on Radio National, and it sums up the kind of perception of Radio National then, but even today. He was interviewed by another senior executive at the ABC, TV news director, who said, you know, Radio National, it's a bit like you're in a lift and you're stuck in a lift and you're between floors, you know, floor 5 and floor 6, and you kind of wet your pants. So you've got a warm feeling, but nobody cares, you know. That's how he described the way in which Radio National was seen, unfortunately, within the network at that time, as well as outside. That's a fair time ago, but it gives you an idea of some of the flavour of the way in which Radio National has been seen.
Right.
Okay. Any other burning questions before it's been a sort of a massive public health pandemic, a massive journalistic challenge worldwide. I mean, let's not take away from it. If you've not had enough, there's another conference on June the 9th at 4 o'clock called The Virus and the Media, based on a book that I've just published 6 weeks after it was commissioned. That's The Virus and the Media, and it's on Amazon, the book, so if you want to buy it, and I think we'll put up the details at the end of this. But thank you everybody for taking part. It's we've come in at 4 minutes past 12, which is pretty good going. Richard Keeble, you want to say a few words?
Yes, very briefly. John, I'd like to thank you and Donald and our guru on the Zoom, Philip Bonds, for organizing a fantastically well, a fantastic conference. I'd like to thank the speakers for keeping to the strict time limits. I have been editing Ethical Space now for 17 years, and I'm actually stepping down at the end of this year. I'd like to publicly thank my joint editors, Sue Joseph and Donald Matheson, for the extraordinary support they've given to me over the years, and all the people I've met through my editing of the journal. This conference is going to form the basis for a double issue of Ethical Space. I've done many, many books with John Mayer over the year, and I'd like to thank him for all the fun I've had with him in doing those. This will also be my last book with John as well, so I'd like to thank him, and I'm sure that given the quality of the presentations at this conference, that double issue, which John will guest edit, will be excellent. So thanks to all.
Okay, well, a last word, please. Anybody from the EGO is still online? Would they like to say a word or two? Paula? No? This, just to say that this is all recorded. It's all on YouTube on the same URL that you've been using today. So if you want to refer to any of it, please pull that up, pass that on to lots of students and other people, because the more viewers, the better. And as I say, there is another one on June the 9th at 4 o'clock on YouTube on the virus and the media. There we are. It's up on your screens now. And thank you everybody for watching, and thank you for persevering, and good afternoon, good evening, or whichever way it is.
Thank you, John.
That's all right, Donald. Cheers. Got away.